Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and in this video we're going to take a look at Unity 2D so you can get an idea of how it works for making 2D games. I have installed here Unity Hub, which you can get from unity.com, and it's just a way of managing your different versions of Unity because there's a lot of different versions out there. You can see that the version we're going to look at today is 2019.2.0F1. By and large, things will be pretty similar depending on the type of the version of Unity that you're using. One word of caution that there are a lot of versions out there, and I think that's why Unity has come out with Unity Hub to help you manage your projects and also the versions of Unity that you have. I wouldn't recommend upgrading Unity in the middle of a project. I've had that happen before and it did not go well. So once you get a version of Unity, I'd recommend just sticking with it for your whatever project you're working on, and then perhaps upgrading or moving on to the next version when you have completed that project so you don't break anything. I'm going to open something up called Intermancy Platformer. This is just a basic platformer I've made, which we'll look through in this tutorial because it has a lot of the different features that Unity 2D works with. And we'll give you an idea, like an overview of what you might be dealing with if you're making a 2D game. If you've seen any of my other videos, specifically about game development and game engines, you'll know that I do quite like Unity as a game engine. I think that it does a lot of things very well. Once you kind of get your head around how Unity works and how Unity wants you to make it work, you can have a pretty quick development cycle and workflow with it. It can be challenging for new users and particularly people who are beginners at game development and also at coding to kind of wrap your head around how Unity works and how game development and coding in general work. So I'd recommend, although this may be an unpopular opinion, I'd recommend brushing up on your C# first because that's the language that Unity uses for scripting, either by doing Microsoft tutorials or other types of tutorials. Just kind of like get the basics of the C# language so that that's not a new thing that you're getting thrown at for learning to develop within Unity. It will just help you. It'll help ease the learning curve and the whole development process for you if you have some understanding of C# beforehand. Learning Unity is a little bit like trying to learn to code as well as learning Photoshop and like video editing and animation all at the same time. It's just, there's a lot to deal with, and there are a lot of layers of Unity even in 2D development, which must be said, it can be a little bit easier than 3D development. So if you have a good handle on C#, or if you're just, handy with this type of interface in the first place, you'll be in better shape and you'll get less frustrated as you're trying to get things to work. The first thing we're going to look at is the basic user interface here, so you can kind of understand where things are in the Unity game engine, specifically for 2D. Right here, I have the different tools that I'm going to use for my development. For example, if I'm going to move things around, I will use the move tool, or if I want to move the whole like world around, I will use the hand tool. These you'll get used to by doing it, and I find that they're actually the least important part of what you're going to be using for your game. Here on the left, I have the hierarchy of a scene that I'm working on in Unity. You can think of a scene as a different area of your game that is distinct from other areas. For example, it could be one particular game world and a platformer. It could be your main menu. It could be your pause menu. It could be the main state of your game, depending on the type of game that you will make. And this hierarchy displays all of the different objects that are in that scene, and you can nest objects within one another, and it's a good way of keeping track of where everything is. For example, if I click on my player, I see that it's actually, in fact, let me go to this scene just so you can see what the game looks like. It's this basic cyberpunk platformer where you can't do very much right now. But I can click on my player. I can click on the ground, which is an invisible object that you can't see as a player. I can click on the skyline, which are the background images that you see. I can click on a wall on the right side and also on the left side that I've placed. So the hierarchy allows you to see all of the different objects that you've placed in this game world. And there are a lot of good Unity tutorials out there that will show you bit by bit how you construct a world like this. And that's not the intention of this video. The idea behind this video is just to give you an overview so that when you go into those tutorials, you feel equipped with a high level view of how all of these things work together, which is not something I had when I started making games in Unity. So hopefully it's helpful for you. On the bottom here, you have the project tab, which is essentially a file explorer that shows you how the file system works and all the different things that you have. You create this file system by adding folders and then putting stuff in them. For example, I'm in the scripts folder, which is nested under my assets folder, and I'll talk about what these scripts do a little bit later. But then I really only have one main scene. This demo scene is not really anything interesting. And then if I have different materials that I'm using in my world, or I can put everything here in my art folder if I have sprites or environment art that I want to use. And like I said, all of this could be just dumped in one folder, and you can be as messy as you like. I mean, you've seen my desktop. There's not much going on there, but maybe your desktop is different and you have a method to your madness. But this is the project area is basically where you keep track of all your stuff. You can also click over to the console so that when you play the game, if you have any errors thrown, or if you've told your game to log anything, that will happen here. I obviously haven't done so. Before talking about what else we can do in this project area, let me just talk about the inspector on the right-hand side. When I click on an object here in the hierarchy, I will see in the inspector everything that I need to know about that specific object. For example, the skyline is this an image back here that I have behind all the other stuff. And when I click on it, I see the transform position, the rotation and scale of it. And obviously a lot of these, you're not really going to work with the Z-axis if you're working with a 2D game. If you're working with a 3D game, that will be different. And I've also attached, it's a sprite, so it has a sprite renderer that does certain things that you can tinker around with. But if I click on my player, for example, which itself I've attached another object to it that we won't get into right now. There's a lot more here. There's a sprite that goes along with it. There's an animator that helps, that basically manages my animation. There's a collider, which manages, as you would imagine, collisions. There's a rigid body that helps me manage the physics. And then there's a player manager script that's all attached to this one little player that we haven't done anything with yet. And we'll take a look at a few of those different aspects of it, but just showing you that the inspector allows you to click on an object and see everything about that object. Finally, we have this main pane here, which we haven't talked about, which is this is my scene, and this is like the essentially what I see as a developer, where I can move stuff around and I can drop things onto this scene and make changes. If I click on the game window, it takes me to what that game is actually going to look like, and I can change things like the aspect ratio and where I want it to display, and the scale, and a bunch of other stuff. But this is what the game looks like when I play it. And up here I have this play, pause, and step forward button. I'm just going to hit play, and then whatever state the game is in right now, it allows me to run the game. So essentially now it's in a playable version. You see my little sprite jumping up and down in her idle animation, and then you can't see this, but I'm running using the arrow keys. I'm running back and forth. I can shoot using the space bar. I can crouch. I can jump. Forward. I can jump going back this way. I can't jump and shoot, but I can jump and then shoot. I can crouch and shoot. So there's lots of different things, a basic, very, very, I wouldn't even call it a prototype. It's just like a little demo that we can do here. And you'll notice that the background scrolls as she runs, and I've added a camera using what's called Cinemachine here so that when she reaches a certain spot, the camera zooms in on her. And I can do all that using the game window here. If I go back to the scene window, I see everything, and I can like move things around and try them out in real time and see if the changes are meaningful to me. You'll notice also that it has, if you go to unity.com, you can access the asset store using your Unity account and like buy assets. You can access it from right within the browser as well. Right within the browser that is integrated into Unity as well. And, if you want to look for a template or some art, like go for it. You can do that all from the safety of your Unity client. One note about this is that when I started looking for a prototype, looking to make a prototype for a game, a tabletop game that I'm making, I wanted to make a digital version of it so that I could iterate on it and try different things, run the numbers and run simulations essentially. I thought, well, cool, I'll just download a template and it'll do most of the work for me. And there are a lot of great, card game templates out there. But what I found was that my game was so specific that I would need to rewrite so much of the code that was provided in that template that I might as well just start from scratch myself. So if you're thinking, I'm going to get into Unity and I'm just going to not have to write any code and I'm just going to use a template and then boom, I'll have a game. It probably is not going to work that way unless you're doing like a Hearthstone clone or, a clone of a very basic RPG and just download a template. Or if you don't care that your art assets are I don't want to say generic because there's a lot of very specific art out there, but if your art assets are shared with others, if you don't mind that, then it might work for you. But just beware that if you're coming to Unity with a very specific game idea, the asset store might help you, but it might also, like for me, it really hasn't helped me at all. The best way that it has helped me is I've looked at 2D game templates, card game templates, and looked at their code and kind of figured out how they're doing certain things, and it's helped me make my code better. So now that we have taken a general overview of these different things, I'd like to show you a few things that are very specific to 2D game development. And I should heavily caveat this by letting you know that although I think Unity is a good 2D game engine, I also think it's a better 3D game engine. And I think it's a more native 3D engine, meaning that if you're making 3D games, you'll feel like everything just works the way that it should, and or at least better than its 2D game engine. Its 2D game engine feels like you're making 2D games on this flat plane in a 3D game world. Like what you see here, obviously it's just like a 2D plane, but it feels like it's actually a 3D game engine that is just like I'm flattening it and I'm using it to make my 2D game. So things like pixel perfection are a little bit difficult to make if you're trying to make work, if you're trying to make a pixel perfect game, or the animator we'll see is a little bit clunky. It doesn't feel natural like some other 2D game engines. For example, if you try to use Unity and then you go over and use GameMaker, you'll notice that GameMaker just feels natively 2D. And I don't know that in a larger sense it's a better 2D game engine because it has its own idiosyncrasies that we don't have to get into here. Or you could use Construct 3, or if you just want to code, you could use Phaser. Like there's a lot of options out there, and all of them have their caveats. Unity's caveat is that it has a steep learning curve, and also it doesn't feel natively 2D, and sometimes you'll feel like you're just kind of forcing it to do what you want it to do, or it's forcing you to make your game the way it wants you to make it. But some of the things you'll deal with, for example, is your animator. For example, I've created a bunch of animators for my player here. You can access the animator here. If it's not a tab here, you can go to Window and then Animation and then Animator, and it'll bring this thing up, which another thing you'll notice is that a lot of things are nested like way deep into the menus of Unity, and I'm not really sure why that is the way that it is, but it'll definitely take you some time to figure out like where was the animator again? How do I get there? Or how do I find like the preferences for my specific game build? And we'll take a look at that as well. So if I'm looking at the animator, there's a few different things that you see here, and like I said, this is not meant to be a tutorial of how these things work, just where they are and give you a general overview. But for example, the animator here, it has a flow of like what happens when different triggers in the game are triggered. Like when the character is idle, it will do a certain animation. When it moves to go jump, it'll trigger another animation. Where it's just moving, it'll do another animation. And this part of the animator demonstrates all of the different logic that happens that moves from one state of the game to the next. So if you go back to our game and take a look at the animation right now, my character has an idle animation where she just like, kind of bops up and down. And then when I make her run, that triggers the animator to say, hey, we need to run this other animation, which is when she's running. But then she stops and that says, hey, trigger this other animation where she's just idle again. Or she jumps and it says, hey, trigger the jump animation. Pretty basic stuff if you're familiar with 2D game development. But with Unity, I actually think this interface is a little bit more elegant than if I go into a specific animation. For example, if I double click this idle animation, we see that I have different a sprite that I'm using to create that animation or a series of sprites to create that animation. And this is my idle jumping left animation. And this can be a little bit challenging to kind of like wrap your head around, particularly if you're coming from another animator that does it a little bit better or a little bit more user-friendly manner. I'm thinking of like Construct or Game Maker are just really good at animation and making it streamlined for you to understand, and all the things are in one place, whereas in Unity you have to go to different places to see them. But essentially the way that it works is that I create these different animations and then I manage them in this animator to determine what's going to happen to the animations and when, depending on the particulars of your game. Something else that you'll want to be aware of is like how to drop game objects in the world and why you would want to. The very most basic thing is if you just come up to this menu and you say game object and then create an empty game object, then you can like add stuff onto this game object by, let's say you create a script. We'll go to my scripts and I want to just add this to my game object. I can do that. And then that's that. Like that's pretty simple. Like let's say I want to add a sprite to it, or like you saw, I added a script, or I want to add, a camera to it. I could totally do that. If I wanted to add something else, like for example, user interface, I would go to game object, UI. And then if I want to add text to it, I could, or an image or a button or a canvas. There are a lot of different types of game objects, and most of them you can just add from here, from the game object menu, which is different from your assets menu and different from your components menu. For example, I can drop a game object in here, but then I'm like, okay, I want to add a rigid body to my game object, and I'm like, well, it's not here. Maybe it's in. Oh yeah, it's in the components menu. But where? And then I'll be like, oh, it's in the physics menu. Oh, but wait a minute. No, I'm using physics 2D. So I'm going to add a rigid body here. And then it'll add a rigid body to my game object so that I can now start playing with the physics of that game object. Great. So also up here, if you go to edit, you can do things like change your snap settings so that you can, if you want like a snap to grid for your pixels that you're using in the art that you're using for your game, you can do that here. There are two menus in particular that I find that I'm using often. One is the project settings menu item. This brings up your project settings menu, and you'll if you're doing tutorials, for example, you'll come in here often and determine like, what's the gravity scale going to be? Is it normal, or is it like, are you on the moon? What's the layer collision? If you're creating different layers in the game, you might want some layers to collide with others, but not others. And you'll do that in here. You can also go like into specific settings for PC, Mac, and Linux standalone, or you can decide on your splash image here. You can mess around with the different inputs in your game. You can mess around with the audio. There's just a lot of different things. Or if you want to customize the editor, you can do that here. There's a lot of different things that you'll find in your project settings. And if you're like me, you'll hear about them in a tutorial, or you'll be working on it and totally forget where that is. Well, it's under Edit and then Project Settings, which is different from your Preferences, which is like if you've installed something like Cinemachine, as I discussed before. That's a different way of handling your cameras. You'll come in here and mess with those. If you want to mess with your tile palette, you can do that. Maybe you'll have some general things that you want to change. I don't spend a lot of time in the preferences. I mostly spend them in the project settings. But if you're looking for them, this is where they are. And then finally, if you go to build settings, that's under File, and for some reason not under Edit, but I'm not complaining, I'm just letting you know. You go to build settings. This is what happens when you're actually trying to build a game. If I have multiple scenes, I'll want to make sure all of them are included in this scenes and build section of the build settings. I can determine what platform I'm trying to build for. I can select other options here, and then I can build the game or build and run. So let's say I wanted to do this not on PC but on web. It will remove a lot of those options and just I think here, because I don't have the WebGL installed, like I might not be able to actually build it here. But in any case, this is where you do like, I want to make the game now, or I want to like build the game so that I can play it and not in just this, not just this in Unity browser. That's where I can do all that stuff. And I think one more aspect that we should look at, so that you feel comfortable with it, is the scripts. When you create a new script, I've collected my scripts in this folder called scripts, and I have 3 different scripts. One of them is for the Cinemachine camera that basically says, okay, hey, when my character, let's take a look at this game again, when my character reaches this trigger, then zoom in, otherwise zoom out. And we can get out of here, go back into our scene, and we can see the area in which the trigger happens. I think it's under cameras. Where did I put this? Yeah, the Cinemachine collider. No, the trigger. So when she actually literally runs past this trigger here, that's when it tells Cinemachine, hey, change the camera. But in any case, what's important here is that when you click on a script, it will show you a preview of that script here in right in the Unity client, which is kind of cool, but you can't really do much with this. Let me show you a more robust script. This is a script that I just called Player Manager, which is attached. Again, when I click the player, it shows me my in the inspector like a preview of all the stuff that's attached to the character, and one of them is this Player Manager script. So if I double click on this Player Manager script, it's going to open Visual Studio, which is the code editor that comes with Unity, which is put out by Microsoft. And if you're not familiar with Visual Studio, it might actually be a good thing to just build a couple of small programs in it, or just get familiar with it in terms of how it handles code, maybe in your C# tutorials, just so that's not another thing that you're layering on top of Unity in terms of things you need to learn. And I'm not going to go over the code here. It's going to remind you that you could update it. I'm not going to go over the code here. I think that's just a different tutorial entirely. I just want to show you that this is what Visual Studio looks like, and this is where all of the codes the code in your scripts is going to live, and you can open different tabs to have different scripts open and edit them. And when you save them, it will automatically, you're actually saving a file on your computer, so Unity will update to access that new version of the file. And then if you make, this is kind of interesting, if you make a variable public, you can access it from within the game client itself. For example, right now I'm on the script, but the script itself. But if I look at the player and then I scroll down to where the script has been added, I can drag and drop this Ceridium object. Here I have a public game object Ceridium. So I basically say like, hey, there's a public game object that I want to put here. And then I have dragged a public game object called Ceridium, which is in a different folder, which we'll discuss in a second. I can drag and drop that right here and say, this is the Ceridium that I'm talking about. And then if I create other public variables, like I have a public float, which is called speed, and a public float called jump force, and those are exposed as they're called in the inspector, and I can change these on the fly. Like if I'm in the game window and I press play, I will I have a specific jump speed, and if I wanted to change the gravity, I could do that. But let's say I change the jump force, I change my speed to like 20 and go back into the game. Now she's super fast. So like if you're trying to iterate on a game, and let's change just for the heck of it, let's change the jump force to 5,000. If you're in a game, you want to try different variables, different things. Like now she's jumping super tall and it looks super weird, but that's one of the reasons why you would use a public variable in your script, so you could access it from within the editor. Now when I go back and I stop the game from running, it returns to the original variables, which are quantities, which are 3 and 3,000 instead. And if I start the game again, it'll go back to normal. The final thing that I want to talk about is prefabs, and which is funny because prefabs are highly used in Unity, but I think you need to have like an overview of everything else before understanding what prefabs are. Essentially, if I create something in the game world by creating a game object like this, I can drag it from here to the project folder. Let's say I've created a prefabs folder just for this, and then it will create a prefab of that object so that I don't have to create it a million other times in the same way. Like, let's say I'm creating a top-down 2D game and I want a bunch of monsters. And instead of creating, and they're all the same, they all have the same hit points, they all have the same behaviors and animations or whatever. All I have to do is create that once, and then I can drag it here to the project folder, and then I can drag that onto the game world like 100 times, and it will be the same object, but the same type of object, but it's a prefabricated object, so I don't have to like add a script to it again and add a sprite to it and like change its values or whatever. I can just drag and drop that prefab into the game world 100 times and move them around at my leisure, or maybe I'll make specific edits to each one of them. And a prefab, and creating a bunch of prefabs is going to help you with your workflow so that you don't have to recreate the wheel every time you want to add something new to your game world. So that can be pretty useful for you. I hope this video has been useful in showing some of the different aspects of Unity 2D to you. If it has been, that's great, and please like this video and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me on Twitter, and please feel free to check out my books, and we will see you soon.